everybody. We're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
And you are very welcome to our final piece of coverage about Brazil for now. Yeah. I'm sure we will continue to talk about Brazil in the weeks and months and years to come, but we are wrapping up our 2022 Colonizers World Tour coverage of Brazil for the month of April. Yesterday's video, or previously in the playlist, we talked about basically sports and COVID, the 2014 World Cup, the 2016 Rio Olympics, and the COVID and Bolsonaro of it all. And for today's piece of art, we are talking about sports, not COVID, because COVID's a little fresh for there to be a proper documentary or piece of art about it, just a little fresh. So we are talking about the 2021, very fresh, documentary on Netflix, Pele, which is about the footballer Pele. If you know nothing about Brazil, I hope you at least know. That's probably the extent of what I knew. I'd have to go back and look at what we knew, what we didn't know when we did Brazil last year, and I would imagine my answer probably was Pele.
and the rainforest. You knew about the rainforest.
I was like, I know about the rainforest and Pele. If you watched our video yesterday, you know we have very different relationships with the sport of football and histories with it. If you didn't watch it, too long didn't read. Dr. Kristen grew up in a football-loving household and family. I grew up in a hockey-loving family and household. I did watch football growing up, not to the extent of Dr. Kristen. So we had very different experiences of this film, which is going to be fun to talk about, I think. So this film is basically the story of Pele's career as a player for the Brazilian national team.
Yes.
It also talks about the development of his professional football side, and he played for the club Santos in Brazil for most of that same time period. We get very a brief introduction to just his childhood and growing up. His dad was a footballer who was fairly successful. That's where he learned and loved the sport. But it's pretty much the story of 17-year-old Pele joining Santos and the Brazilian national team in time for the 1958 World Cup in Sweden, and then going through to the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, which is he retired from the Brazilian national team after the 1970 World Cup. So it's pretty much that story. It is the story of Pele and kind of the global phenomenon that he became very quickly in that time, but it is also a little bit about the story of Brazil during that period, which, is one of the reasons why we love sports documentaries, because they're not just about sports. They're about politics and culture and countries. And so we get a specific insight into specifically the 40s and 50s in Brazil and what that meant. And then also after the military coup in 1964 and kind of the perceptions of Pele and football within the dictatorship until the point of his retirement. So that's the scope of the film. For me, certainly what I got out of it was a much greater appreciation for Pele, the phenomenon, the sports icon. I knew, and I'd seen clips here and there. I grew up in a sports loving family. My dad always had any sport on, so we would watch the World Cup if the U.S. was playing. I heard a lot of stuff kind of in the periphery. We lived in the UK for 5 years, which is pretty big, heavy football loving part of the world. We watched a lot of football together, Premier League, World Cup, Euros, all that jazz. I love the sport. I just didn't know as much of the history of it. So for me, and especially outside the UK, I said this to my mom last night. I was like, I was telling her about what I learned about Pele and how, in the 1966 World Cup, he was injured in England, and I was like, I know about that World Cup, and my mom was like, why that one? I was like, oh, I lived in the UK, and you can't.
I was like, that's the last time England won. Yeah,
I was like, you can't live in the United Kingdom for like 2 weeks without hearing about the fact that the last time the English team won the World Cup was when they hosted in 1966.
I mean, it's part of the visa application. Like, can you describe a custard cream biscuit?
When was the last time?
Yeah, like, who is Sir Elton John, and when was the last time England won the World Cup?
Yeah, so it was so funny. So that was fun to get that, like, different kind of lens for 66 as well. I enjoyed that. But yeah, so I think it was both it's a good documentary for the way it explains Brazil's love of football and passion for football. And
it is its religion.
It is,
like, it is its civic religion. If America's civic religion is capitalism, Brazil's civic religion is football.
Yeah, and it's true for a lot of places, but certainly for Brazil, there's a huge sense of national identity wrapped up in the football. Massive. And you know, the relationship of Pele to that was fascinating to me, and kind of the global context for football. So I got a lot out of it because I didn't know a lot of this story. So as a sports fan, I was excited. I didn't know if they won in 58 or 62 or 66 or 70. And so, like, you get caught up in the drama of it, especially in 1970. Like, by the time they get to the 70 World Cup at the end of the documentary, they've built a lot of anticipation for, like, this is his last World Cup, and, like, can they do it again? And 1966 was such a disappointment. God forbid you don't win 4 World Cups in a row, but that is the level of expectation and pressure on the Brazilian football team. So yeah, I was excited by it. We get some insight into Pele as a person, but not a lot. It's mostly Pele the football player. I think we do get some really interesting insight into the amount of pressure he felt being an icon. And you talked about it offline when we were discussing it yesterday. But the one line that a journalist says, like, he was almost a prisoner of his celebrity status. And we talk about that a lot on this channel in terms of, you know, Paris Hilton, Britney Spears, lots of other celebrities that are kind of incarcerated by the giantness of their status. So we get a little bit from that, which I enjoyed. We get a lot about his relationship with his teammates. We talked about this offline. I don't know if Pele is a good person. I think he's an exceptional talent on the football field, and I think he's also a good teammate. Whether or not, it's not about, this documentary is not really about Pele the person, but I love that he still has all these relationships with his teammates, and they all sit around and, like, crack jokes. And it seemed like from the footage to me that, like, yeah, he was a fantastic goal scorer, but he learned to also help other people score goals, especially because he just got, like, entirely overrun with defenders. And, you know, there's a lot of goal scorers that don't take that avenue. They're like, oh, I can't score, I'm now upset about it. He was like, oh, it's really hard for me to score with this defense. How can I help other people score? Because it's about the team. So that, I think, is the what I got out of this documentary, and what I learned a lot. Dr. Kristen, what was, from the flip side of being a person who knew a lot of this history and knew a lot about football going in, thoughts and feelings about Pele?
Yeah, like, I've watched the whole World Cup final a couple times from 1970. Like, I just had it on in the background as I've done other things. So,
not so exciting when you know the results.
It was interesting, I think, because I read a lot of critics about this, because I really wanted to know what the critical reception of this documentary was. And everyone that is a football stan loved this thing. And the people who came at it as movie critics were slightly less enamored. For a couple different reasons. One, I don't think it's a very well constructed documentary. I think it really could have, it's made by two Englishmen who obviously love football. And because of that, they assume, I think, a weird amount of knowledge. They either expect you to know absolutely nothing, or they expect you to know absolutely everything. So for those of us like me who fall in between that camp, like, I've watched, I'm not a, like, you know, Pele devotee, but I'm also interested, I was coming to this to hopefully talk a little bit more about the human than the player. I knew a lot about the player. I didn't really need to learn a lot about the player. I was hoping for more about the man. And that, the documentary is not interested in that. What the two gentlemen who made it said over and over again in every interview I read with them was that they were trying to get beyond the talking points. They were trying to get beyond the rehearsed answers he's given forever. So they are one of the only documentarians ever to confront him on the junta, ever. And I think that's incredibly brave and really, really good. And it shows, I think it took 8 months of negotiation to get in the room with him.
Wow.
I mean, they went after it. Like, he very famously does not give interviews anymore, and he will not talk about things that are not football. All of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think to really put it in context is that Pele is a deity. He's not a human. And two people who believe in Pele's deity, they don't want him to have feet of clay. They don't want to hear about the mistakes that he made. They don't want to hear about the 6 children he has with 6 different women, none of whom speak highly of him as a father, and in a big Crosby kind of energy. Like, he wasn't abusive, he just wasn't present. Good. Yeah. He didn't seem to care about any of them, and that kind of thing. So some of it is, what are you coming to this for? If you're coming to be taught about Pele the football deity, you're going to get everything. If you're coming to this to have a little bit more humanity imbued into Pele, the football deity, you may be disappointed. A lot of critics were. Yeah. I wouldn't call myself disappointed. I would call myself, I wasn't actually bored, but there was a couple times where I was like, what is the point of the story you're telling me right now? I couldn't find their through line until I sat back at the end and thought, oh, this was just entirely about trying to make this deity a little bit human, but not really enough. And because they aren't interested in that. Also, I think we still have trouble getting people of that generation on the record talking about the dictatorship. And I think some of that is because they don't believe that the dictatorship is gone. And this is the same thing we see in Northern Ireland. Like, people don't talk about being disappeared or anything else. One of the reasons that Say Nothing is so revolutionary, the book Say Nothing, about the disappearance of Jane McConville, that was written by Patrick Raddenkeefe, is A, that it's written by an outsider, and B, it's a seminal work on like one case, but there's so many others where we don't talk about Bruno. We don't talk about these things. Yeah. And so to have him admit at all that he knew things is utterly revolutionary. But people who have a different perspective on that situation look at that really critically and say, okay, so if he knew something, he could have done something. Yeah. And this is the soapbox I would like to get on. He was a football deity. He was not a revolutionary. I don't know if he's a good dude in terms of like that fundamental like Coach Taylor goodness. I think he's an adequate dude who's a football deity. Uh-huh. And for us to expect that because he had fame, he should have used it for anything other than staying alive is almost kind of rude of us.
Like, yeah, and I enjoyed the part of that documentary where they explored that a little bit, and it was interesting because I didn't yet read the critiques that Dr. Kristen is talking about before we started filming this. So I didn't know that about the filmmakers, but that makes a lot of sense. And I think like they were both limited by the story that they wanted to tell and limited by what Pele would give them.
Completely valid. And I think the critics are like, well, you could have gone after more detractors. I'm like, why? Why would they do that? That's isn't the point of this thing.
That's not the story they wanted to tell. They weren't telling the story of like how people reacted to the dictatorship.
And I think there is a very valid critique to be had about somebody with as much power as he had, that he didn't ever use it, even after the junta was gone. Like, he's never spoken out about that was terrible, or that's a blight on Brazil's history, or, like, sure, you want to critique someone with that much social power. You can. My argument is still, it may not be a valid critique because it's assuming that he sees that as part of his life.
Yeah.
And to assume that he sees that as part of his life is rude.
It's prescribing your expectations on somebody else. Like, just because he's a football icon doesn't mean he's a left-leaning political person. We don't know his politics. And, like, they bring it up in the documentary, and they bring up some comparisons, and one journalist in particular was talking about how disappointed he was in Pele's silence on this, and compared it to Muhammad Ali refusing the draft for the Vietnam War. And then another journalist came on and was like, come on, dictatorships are dictatorships. Muhammad Ali was not living in a dictatorship. He did not fear for his life and security and family at the same level of Pele at that time. And I was like, I was glad that somebody said it. Like, I understand the perspective of the journalists that expected more. Like, I understand where it's coming from. I don't necessarily agree with it. Because I agree with you. It's not for us to prescribe politics onto people. But I was glad that the guy was just like, dictatorships are dictatorships, man. Like, what are you... We don't know what his life was... We don't know what his internal life was like.
And, like, I've never lived under a dictatorship. And
Nope.
so all I've ever done is watch things about it, read things about it. I'm reading a brilliant novel right now about life under the Romanian dictatorship in the 1980s, for instance. And I cannot fathom the amount of tiny moral compromises you have to make to simply exist.
To survive. Yeah.
Like, yeah, I mean, it's just, I just can't fathom it. So in terms of, like, we talk about the structure, this is a documentary that could have really benefited from a narrator.
Yeah.
Really could have benefited from someone, even just BBC style, telling us the facts of where we are in a timeline.
Yep. It really could have.
Really helped.
Yep.
But this is one of the downfalls sometimes of documentary makers who are enamored with their subject, is that they can't get out of their own lens on the subject. They made a movie about a footballer for football fans. That's what they made. And so they didn't think about the experience, I don't think, critically. Well, I shouldn't say that. If they thought about the experience of non-football fans, they didn't. I don't think they accounted for it within the finished product.
It doesn't appear as though they did from our perspective.
From our perspective. But I think to me, and this is as obviously, like I just said, there's been times in my life I have fallen asleep to the replays of the 1970 World Cup. Because it's one of the most beautiful examples of this game that I love. Just the style of play. The beauty of the play in 1970 is just mwah, mwah. You don't see pretty football that much anymore. We see either very dramatic football, #Argentina, or we see very tactical football. Every once in a while, some of the Premiership teams will, like, flirt with it. There's been some really beautiful stuff at Man City and Liverpool in the last couple of years, but, like, nothing like a consistently whole game where I'm just like, oh, that's like ballet with a ball. Like, that's what that I'm watching.
It was remarkable to see even just clips of the Brazilian team from that era. Like, I had never seen football like that. And
you never will again.
No.
Like, this is a time capsule of football.
For sure, the game has changed so much. And it even changed, like, during that time period as well.
Oh, yeah, because the 74 World Cup's boring.
Yeah, in response, in part, to, like, the dominance of the Brazilian team and Pele. And, and so that was a cool part of it.
Neymar, who is the current, like, one-name Brazilian, doesn't play anything like that. Yeah. He's not artistic. He is powerful and fast. Yeah. But he's not artistic. I wouldn't call him an artistic player. I digress. To me, the more interesting conversation is about the expectations that the critics were putting on this thing when they came into it.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that interesting to talk about, especially because this team also made a documentary on Maradona. Now, Maradona famously was politically active and spoke out a lot about the poor treatment of the citizens of Argentina and was very, very politically active. And people do draw comparisons between the two of them in that way. That I don't know. We haven't gotten to Argentina on CWT yet. So what I know of Argentina, I know from Evita. So I'm not exactly like well regarded here. But I would think that's a more fair comparison than to Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting. I am going to watch their Maradona documentary soon-ish because I don't know if we're going to get to Argentina until like 2026. So
Argentina was a Spanish colony, right?
I believe so, yes. Yeah, I speak Spanish, so I would say Spanish colony.
Yeah, so we're not, I don't know that we're getting back to Spanish colonies anytime soon.
Not until 24 at the earliest. So we have too many British and Russian ones to cover.
We're trying to hit as many different colonizers as we can.
Yeah, and we'll cycle back. We already did Spanish. We covered, if anyone had joined us for the week on Equatorial Guinea, in which we discovered that Spain had a colony in Africa. That was a time. That was a time for all of us, honestly.
What a fascinating part of the world, Equatorial Guinea.
Part of the world Equatorial Guinea is. So, a dictator who killed someone because they were wearing glasses. So that's a really great reminder. I have never been under threat simply because I was wearing glasses. Brazil it's also... one of the critics that I read who was particularly vociferous, it does not identify as Brazilian, says that he is originally from Mexico City, is living now in the United States. And it's one of those things where sometimes I just want to say, I've been looking at Brazil for 5 weeks and I'm overwhelmed and confused. So if you've been looking at Brazil for 5 minutes, my guess is you have no idea what's going on. So could we all just take a breath and say the dude was a dude?
Yeah.
And because some of the critics talk about how hard it was to have him walk in on a walker, and that didn't affect me at all. I was like, he's like 80. He's allowed to not have knees anymore.
I'm sure he doesn't have knees. Yeah.
A couple of the reviews were like, it was really difficult to see him walk in with a Zimmer frame. And I was like, okay, we're coming at this from different perspectives.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. And some of that is because it's not like Pele has showed up after he retired.
Right. Like, he disappeared.
Because he retired from international football in 1970. He played for the Cosmos for Santos, until 1973. And then he finished out his career for the New York Cosmos.
Yeah.
And then once we hit 80, Pele's never seen playing football again.
Yeah.
As far as I know. Maybe because there isn't like football pro-am the way there is golf.
Right.
So, that could be that people still in their mind think of him in that freeze frame from the 70s, and that's why. But I just would have been like, well, he's 80.
Yeah.
But he was also never my deity.
Right.
And I'm reading some of these critics. He was one of their deities.
Yeah.
And still is. And when you remember that your deity is human, it's hard. It's very hard.
It's really hard. Yeah.
And I think that was really fascinating. So we've talked around this documentary quite a bit. Overall, I don't think it's bad. It just wasn't for me. I either wanted more or I wanted different structure. Because I knew all the facts they were giving me, and I had seen a lot of the clips. So the clips were beautiful. But, and spending time with his teammates was really cool, but it wasn't what I was in the documentary for, I guess. I walked in thinking this was going to be about the human.
Yeah.
And it was not. And I just kept waiting for us to get the human, and we didn't. And so I walked away a little disappointed. But that's not anyone's fault. I had different expectations than what the filmmakers were doing.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, I think it raises an interesting conversation. It doesn't actually have the conversation in so much time in the documentary of how we enjoy problematic things or, separate our political aspirations from what's happening culturally. It raises that conversation, which I think is interesting, and a conversation you can continue after the documentary. You can't really have it with the documentary. But, one of the things that I really enjoyed was the one journalist who was very, left-wing, anti-dictatorship, and who had these expectations, and was kind of upset at the way, the whole country was kind of forgetting about the dictatorship.
Yeah.
Because it was the World Cup. And he said, because people were afraid that if Brazil won, it would reinforce the dictatorship, bolster the dictatorship. And this guy said, but with football, your heart rules your head. You forget your principles when the ball starts rolling.
So true.
And I thought
Hashtag how I watched the World Cup. Hashtag how I'm watching Qatar this summer.
We had this conversation at length in our 101 for this week about how we reconcile with FIFA being a really corrupt organization and the Olympics being very corrupt, and how we can enjoy things like the World Cup in the midst of a dictatorship. And I took a lot of value from the kind of the closing scenes of Brazil celebrating the World Cup, because I think it's relatable in that we had this conversation a lot about Northern Ireland, that like you learn to live with the abnormal, you learn to make the abnormal normal, and you learn to celebrate what you can amidst really horrible circumstances. Again, would have been helpful to have a narrator kind of talk people through that, because like you and I got that lesson from it, because we've had this conversation a lot, and we lived in Northern Ireland and like had that kind of experience. I would have appreciated that, like some narration to kind of pull that point out, because I think it's a really valuable part of this conversation that the documentary didn't explicitly make. I think it implicitly made it, and hopefully people will pick up on it. But for me, that was the overarching thing. You forget your principles when the ball starts rolling was a very human thing to say, I think.
Very true. Well, I think that wraps up our conversation on Brazil for now. I think we both recommend this. I would recommend it more as, you can't make it background noise because it's all in Portuguese, but like, go into it realizing that what you're going to watch is the story of a 20-year span of Brazilian football. Yeah. That's what you're going to watch. Yeah. And it's worth it. And if you can track down, if you are a football fan and you have not tracked down a copy of the entire final of the 1970 World Cup, I got it because they used to play it on television at like 2:00 in the morning, and I had a friend that taped it for me. Legitimately.
Nice.
VHS tape. They played it on PBS when we were growing up once. And so
Random.
I think around the 1994 World Cup, maybe, and like the promotion for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's cool.
So that's how I saw it, and then that same friend transferred it to DVD for all of us who were like football people. So,
that's nice.
But I would imagine some libraries somewhere now have it, or the YouTube does.
I was about to say it could be on YouTube for all we know.
For all we know. Anyway, we have learned so much about this beautiful country, this beautiful, broken, brilliant, beside itself country.
Complicated.
And gosh, we are grateful for all of the people that have made all of the resources that have allowed us to enter into this conversation. We're grateful for YouTube, honestly, for the space to have this conversation. Yeah. And while we are hitting pause on Brazil, don't worry, guys, we will definitely be back in the fall with the results of the election and what...
Oh, yes.
And kind of translate what Portuguese experts, Brazilian experts and Portuguese speakers are saying about Brazil. We'll be here to translate it for English speakers and Americans as best we can.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we're going to move on to Italian colonies, because I don't know if you knew this, but Italy had colonies.
They did. They just had a
3
couple. Un poco.
Tiny bit. But just to spoil, they were still shit. They were not great.
Not great.
So we're heading to, and you may have a guess as to how not great they were when I tell you the countries that they colonized.
Aye.
And the state of those countries now, which is Somalia, Libya, and Ethiopia. And then to round it up, we're going to head to Italy itself, because as a colonizer, it has also not exactly been the global superpower that it once was, and it has been run over a little bit. So we're going to be talking about those 4 countries. We're going to be watching art from those 4 countries. We're going back to a country by country, week by week format. And I am honestly excited a little bit to remove myself from Portuguese and learn a little bit about Somalia. I can't lie.
A little bit, yeah. I don't know anything about Somalia or Ethiopia, and I know very little about Libya. So I'm excited. I know a lot about Italy, a freakish amount about Italy. So it'll be cool. But I've never thought about them in the colonizers' context, so that'll be fun. But no word of a lie, I love Portuguese as a language. I do not understand it, and I was like at the point yesterday where I was expecting to hear people speak in Portuguese on my television, because that's how much we've listened to it. So I'm excited to shift to a different language.
I know almost nothing about Italy despite being there. I know more about Ethiopia because I've been. I know enough about Somalia just because I've had to in studying and working in Kenya. And everything I know about Libya, I learned from CNN and Omar Gaddafi.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have an interesting month of May.
Oh, it's gonna be a time. Yeah, it's gonna be
and
a time.
we really, really hope that you join us. In the meantime, our hope for you is that you find as much joy in something as Brazilians find in football. That you find rest amidst the insanity of life, and that you don't feel guilty about being happy, even when circumstances around you aren't. All the best, everybody.
Bye.